Now, eventually, the Crillos will start to lose some of their social power with the arrival of a new group known as the Peninsulares. The Peninsulares basically are individuals who are Spanish, full-blooded Spanish, and they were born in Spain or the Iberian Peninsula, okay, in Europe. And so these peninsulares would eventually occupy the highest positions in society in New Spain. And so with the arrival of more and more peninsulares, you would start to see the decline of conquest society. And what is conquest society? Basically, this is the society of conquistadors, right? The early generations of Spaniards who were ruling New Spain and running things there. Okay, these are the individuals who were having encomiendas, who had rights to certain villages in terms of their tribute and labor. We were talking about that earlier before another time. And so basically this conquest society, you would eventually see it go into decline where these conquistadors and their descendants would eventually lose power. That's what that means by decline of conquest society. They would eventually start losing social power, and these new arrivals, these new immigrants, the peninsulares, would start to gain the best positions in society. So this eventually would create this conflict and tension between the two groups, the Crillos and the Peninsulares. And so, yes, the Crillos eventually would get restricted from some of the more highest positions in society. We're talking about positions in government, right, as government officials, and also positions in the Catholic Church. Okay, those positions would eventually go to the Peninsulares as more and more of them start to arrive in New Spain. The Crillos, now, they wouldn't necessarily all be poor. Some would be, but some Crillos would still have a decent position in society. We'll talk more about them later in ways that they could still, make a profit in colonial society. Okay, but basically, the main point we're making here is that the Peninsulares are arriving and they're starting to get the best positions, the most influential and well-paid positions in government and in the church. Okay, in the church's prestigious positions, right? Not so much well-paid, but maybe you could if you could parlay it in your way. Okay. All right, and so the Creoles would kind of, look with suspicion at the Peninsulares. They would be a little suspect of them because the Peninsulares were taking these best positions and more of them were starting to arrive. But the Peninsulares would also look down on the Creoles. Okay, why would the Peninsulares look down on the Creoles? Well, for one, some of them believed that the Creoles were mixed, possibly, with other races. Maybe they weren't full-blooded Spanish. Maybe some of these Creoles were actually, tainted with Indian blood. Okay, so that would be one way that the Peninsulares would look down on them. Another way is that the Peninsulares and others back in Europe would claim that people who were born in the Americas, in the American environment, were inherently weaker or more feminine than individuals who were born in Europe. Okay, and so this is going to create this distinction between individuals who were born in the Americas, the Creoles, and those who were born in Europe, like the Peninsulares, right? And so basically the idea was that they were weaker, they were more feminine, and it's because of the environment in the Americas, right? Even the animals were weaker in the Americas, according to this philosophy, right? This kind of pseudoscience, this belief that was going on in Europe at the time. People were writing about this. Individuals were writing books about this and saying how, animals and human beings that were born in the Americas were weaker than those who were born in the Old World or in Europe. Okay, so that's another way that the Peninsulares would look down on the Creoles. And the Spanish crown totally supported the Peninsulares. They favored them. All right, that's why the Peninsulares were getting those high positions in government and in the church, right? Because the Spanish crown favored them. Why? Why did the Spanish crown choose to give these positions to the Peninsulares? Because they felt that they could trust them, that they would be more loyal to the Spanish crown and its interests. And its interests, of course, are making a profit, making money. Okay? The idea was that the Creoles, since they were not born in Spain and may have never even been to Spain, may not be loyal to a country and a king that they've never been to or seen, right? They've never been there. So why would they be loyal to this far-off king and this country that they've never been to? while the Peninsulares actually were born there, they're from there, right? They know the culture, and so that's what they're loyal to, and that's what they respect. And so the Creoles, they're kind of separate because they're born in the Americas, so far away. And so it's that ideology that leads to the Spanish crown giving the Peninsulares these high positions because they felt that they're more loyal, that they could trust them, and ultimately that the Peninsulares will help them to gain a profit and maintain order in New Spain. Now, the Crillos, as I was mentioning earlier, are not all poor, right? Just because the Peninsulares are arriving in New Spain doesn't mean that the Crillos are completely supplanted and that they're now going to be poor and impoverished. Not always, right? Some will be, you know. There are definitely some Crillos who are in poverty, but many will still be able to make a profit in New Spain. Some will make a profit by owning farms. These are the haciendas, right? And so a person who owns a farm is known as a hacendado. Okay, so the hacendados, they could make a lot of money, you know, producing agricultural products and selling them on the market. Okay, and so this is where we were talking about debt peonage. It was these individuals who would sometimes get their employees in debt and then keep them there on their haciendas because these individuals couldn't pay back their debt. And so they just keep loaning them, you know, maybe items or maybe even, you know, some kind of form of wealth, and then they're stuck there on the hacienda. And so sometimes these hacendados were actually Creoles. A lot of times they were. These are individuals who are full-blooded Spanish but born in the Americas, right? So Creoles could be hacendados. They could make a lot of profit that way. Other Creoles could make a good profit by having a stake in mines, right? So they could, you know, be miners, and they could maybe have a stake in a mining company. They could make a large profit that way. Another way that Creoles could make money would be as merchants, right? So selling various goods. And so these positions, basically, you could have Creoles that could be part of the economic elite, even though they don't have the most elite positions in New Spain, such as government positions or in the church. They could still make profit as hacendados, miners, and merchants. Now, as we start to get into the 17th century, you start to see the encomenderos, people who had rights to encomiendas, start to fade, right? We talked about this before, how eventually the encomenderos will not have enough heirs, right? They won't have legitimate heirs to take over their encomiendas. They were talking about like the early conquistadors, right? A lot of them didn't have legitimate heirs, and so their encomiendas would just go back to the Spanish crown or the Spanish government instead of being passed on to a family member. But sometimes, if an encomendero did have a family member and they passed away, their encomienda could be passed on to them. And sometimes these were women. Okay, so here's where talk a little bit about gender in New Spain. And so in New Spain, it's possible for a woman to occupy a pretty high position in society if her husband was, say, like an encomendero, and he passed away, and his encomienda would be passed on to her, right, if they were legitimately married. Okay, and sometimes these encomenderas could be women of color, right? It could be it could be Native American or mestiza. If she was married to that encomendero, and when he died, it could be passed on to her, right? Say they didn't have any son. If they didn't have a son, then that encomienda would be passed on to the wife, right? An example of this was Doña Isabel. Isabel basically was a daughter of Motecuazoma, right? Remember Motecuazoma, the Aztec emperor? Who was killed, right, either by the Spanish or maybe by the Aztecs, right? It's up for debate. Well, he had a daughter, right, and his daughter's name was Isabel, and she would eventually be given an encomienda, a very wealthy one actually, by Cortez. So she's an example of a woman who owned an encomienda, right, or owned the rights to labor and tribute from certain areas in New Spain. She'd be married a number of times, but ultimately her descendants would inherit their encomienda. So that is one example of encomiendas which actually did get passed down through hereditary lines, right? Passed on through the generations, when a lot of them did not, but this is one example of one that did. right? But yet, like I was saying, there's other women who also could become encomenderos. You know, say for example, if their husbands died, and even daughters could inherit an encomienda. Right? It's possible. So, for example, like if an encomendero didn't have a wife, maybe his wife died, and he didn't have a son, but he had a daughter, well, that encomienda could go to his daughter. Okay, so it's another example of how you can get a female encomendero, and that could, she could occupy a pretty decent place in society if she had rights to an encomienda. But a lot of times, these female encomenderos or encomenderas would eventually get married again, right? Because there'd be a lot of individuals who want to get married to them because they're wealthy, right? And so that would happen at times. Daughters who inherited encomiendas from their fathers, they would have to get married by law in order to keep their encomiendas. So within a year of inheriting it, they would have to get married. And so in that case, these women may not maintain that position in society by having rights to an encomienda because then their husband would get involved and he would occupy those rights, right?